Human nature is so well disposed towards those who are in interesting situations that a young person who either marries or dies is sure of being kindly spoken of. A week had not... I'm Harriet.
And I'm Ellen, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week we're looking at chapters 22 to 26 of Emma. So let's start with your 100-word summary.
All right. All the talk about Mr. Elton and his bride distresses Harriet, and to distract her, Emma takes her to pay a very short formal call on the Martins. Frank Churchill arrives suddenly, and the Westons bring him to Hartfield, and he suggests calling on the Bateses on their way back. Emma enjoys Frank's company, but is critical of his going to London for a haircut. At the formal dinner at the Coleses, the company learn that Jane Fairfax has received a pianoforte, and Emma tells Frank of her conjectures about Jane and Mr. Dixon. Mrs. Weston suggests a match between Jane Fairfax and Mr. Knightley. The evening ends with dancing.
Okay, you actually put in a few things that I didn't, but some of your wording was almost identical to mine. So here's mine. Highbury is gossiping about Mr. Elton's bride. Emma takes Harriet to pay a call on the Martins, but only for 15 minutes. Frank Churchill finally arrives, and Emma decides she likes him, even though he went to London for a haircut. The Coles hold a dinner party. The hot gossip is that someone has sent Jane a piano. Emma shares with Frank her suspicions about Jane and Mr. Dixon, and Mrs. Weston shares with Emma her suspicions about Mr. Knightley and Jane, which Emma rejects. Emma and Jane both play and sing, and the evening finishes with a dance.
Right, yes.
Did you have anything general to say about these 5 chapters?
My general one is thinking about how Jane Austen is doing this incredible double act of telling you what Frank Churchill's thinking, what Emma's thinking, what Jane's thinking, all with sort of these tiny pieces of dialogue. Yeah. I think it's absolutely amazing what she does.
Except it's not until you read it through the second time that you really know what Frank Churchill's thinking.
Or what Jane's thinking, yes. But, I think that's fascinating. You have to read it the second time to begin to know. First time through, you can be very smart and think you picked up to something going on between Jane and Frank Churchill.
Really not much happens in chapter 22. It's just the introduction of Miss Hawkins and how the gossip of Highbury says that she's wonderful. You do get Emma changing her views on Mr. Elton, where it says she was in fact beginning very much to wonder that she had ever thought him pleasing at all.
She's always moving back on her views. She thinks she is so sure of herself.
Yeah.
But she's always changing views on this one and that one.
Although it does also say she wished him very well, but he gave her pain and his welfare 20 miles off would administer most satisfaction.
Yes.
Which I thought was nice.
Yes.
So the call on the Martins happens in chapter 23. I suppose once again we get this Emma's reprehensible but careful handling of Harriet, of deciding that, well, obviously the call must be returned, but we will keep it to exactly 15 minutes, and she's really hoping that Mr. Martin won't be there. It's kind of a lovely picture of Harriet goes and she sits there and everyone is really uncomfortable.
Yes.
Until they suddenly have that idea about the measurements, which really, it comes into Harriet's childishness, naivety.
Yes.
That's the kind of thing that she gets excited by.
But it's also lovely that Jane Austen notices this. It's this sort of ability to get in the kind of detail that nobody was putting in books at that time. People who'd read her started to be able to do these things, but I don't think anyone else was writing that sort of fascinating, detail of everyday life.
Yeah. That's so character revealing as well. And I think, again, it signals to us that when, after the end of the book, she is married to Mr. Martin,
she'll fit
in, yeah.
They've made a space for her. They sort of understand her, yes.
The other thing that I liked is that when Emma picks her up and sees how happy Harriet is, and it says she would have given a great deal or endured a great deal to have had the Martins in a higher rank of life. They were so deserving that a little higher should have been enough. So she hasn't actually budged on her snobbish, rigid views of the structure of society, but she also does recognise that they're good people. and that Harriet would be happy with them.
Yes.
So all she needs to do is get rid of the prejudices.
Prejudices against the Martins. But the second thing, this incredible boosting of what she sees as Harriet's status.
Yeah. And the next thing that happens is that the Westons say that Frank is coming on a visit. Finally.
Yeah.
We've heard before, but
Yeah.
this time even Mrs. Weston seems to believe it. And Mr. Weston, when he's telling Emma about this and he's saying, it's much better that he comes now than if he'd come at Christmas. It's like he is the definition of optimist.
Yes.
Everything is good the way it is.
Yes.
And when he does turn up, I like the fact that Emma is actually a bit suspicious of him at first, of how determined he is to be pleased and to be pleasing.
Emma's picture of Frank Churchill, even though Jane Austen isn't quite saying it, if we look at it, she's still continuing in her mind that argument she had with Mr. Knightley. She's noticing things with him. Is that on my side or Mr. Knightley's side? And so she's giving a point to Mr. Knightley there.
But I guess the picture I got out of this is that he is so determined to say the things that he thinks people will like.
Yes.
And the bit that really struck me was when it says he got as near as he could to thanking her for Miss Taylor's merits, without seeming quite to forget that in the common course of things it was rather to be supposed that Miss Taylor had formed Miss Woodhouse's character than Miss Woodhouse Miss Taylor's. And that suddenly made me think, it's kind of like Wickham and Elizabeth.
Yes.
Wickham is judging what Elizabeth wanted to hear and presenting
Yes.
himself as the kind of person she wants and saying the kind of things that will get her on side with him. And you get a sense here of the same lack of sincerity in Frank.
But on the other hand, what we've got to remember with Frank, and which we know when we finish the book, is Frank, he's got something to conceal and he knows he's got it
Yeah.
to conceal and he thinks he's justified.
Yeah.
It is not an
Yeah, look,
awful thing he's trying to
No,
conceal.
I wasn't saying he's a crook like Wickham.
But he's also a tease. I mean, we see this side of him.
Yeah.
Because practically everything he does is tease poor Jane.
Yeah. Oh, this is something I'd never noticed before, which is Emma actually reflecting on her own lack of knowledge of the fashionable world. She's been talking about how accomplished Jane is, and he agreed to it, but with so quiet a yes as inclined her almost to doubt his real concurrence, and yet there must be a very distinct sort of elegance for the fashionable world if Jane Fairfax could be thought only ordinarily gifted with it.
Most of the time she's so sure she knows this fashionable world, she knows its rules, but every now and then she realises most of it is from reading or being told.
And then we get some more stuff about Mr. Woodhouse that, again, just having talked about Mr. Woodhouse in our first episode and developed this picture of him as needy and dependent on Emma and with some degree of cognitive limitation.
Yes.
It just comes through again and again and again.
Yes.
Where, you were acquainted with Miss Jane Fairfax, sir, are you? Said Mr. Woodhouse, always the last to make his way in conversation.
Yes.
Yeah. All these pictures that I missed before, that he's one step behind, he struggles to keep up, he can't deal with anything complex.
Yes.
And Emma makes sure that he's not challenged.
Miss Taylor, of course, has been doing it for years.
Yes. So that was chapter 23. And then chapter 24 is Frank coming again, this time with Mrs. Weston.
In this chapter, I feel you can see that the Westons are hoping something will happen between Frank and Emma, because Mrs. Weston brings Frank up, chats with them a minute, and then goes away so they can talk to one another.
Like Emma in the vicarage with Mr. Elton and Harriet.
Yes, but probably not as ostentatiously. No, we start now to get the beginning of that fascinating double stuff where you could watch. It was Frank Churchill begins by being dismissive of Jane Fairfax's looks.
Yeah.
And Emma at first defends Jane, but then she takes Frank's coolness as a sort of permission to offer her own criticisms, which are not criticisms of what she looks like, they're criticisms of her lack of friendliness and warmth.
Yeah.
And Frank then tries to praise Jane's music by mentioning Mr. Dixon, which is fantastic for Emma. And she seizes on this as a support for her fantasy.
Well, not yet.
In her head, we see Emma. thinking this is great.
Mm.
And Frank then abandons his defence of Jane and starts as a sort of private joke to go along with Emma's denigration of Jane.
But see, he has been denigrating her all along on different points. And I guess it's sort of going the other extreme to make sure nobody thinks he likes Jane. He finds fault with everything.
But at the particular point about her music, he does want to say...
True, you're right there. Yes, he does want to say her music is so good that even someone engaged to someone else wants to listen to her.
Well, I think, he feels he's putting her down a bit much.
Yeah.
Second reading, you can see all these thoughts of Frank's running through his mind and him trying to think, what's the right thing to say here?
Yeah.
And Emma then sort of feeling, how far can I go? What can I say? Because basically it's lovely for her to come up against somebody that she can criticise Jane to.
Yeah.
And that's something she's never had a chance to do in all these years.
Yeah, because the person she talks to most is Mr. Knightley, but there's no way...
Well, the moment she started showing any sort of jealousy of Jane Fairfax, Mr. Knightley would jump on her.
Yeah.
And probably so would Miss Taylor.
Yeah. One thing Frank said that struck me is when they're talking about Jane's reserve, and Frank says, there is safety in reserve but no attraction. One cannot love a reserved person. He is just lying through his teeth there. But that is almost exactly what Mr. Knightley is going to say later in the book, when his main reason for not being in love with Jane Fairfax is she's too reserved and he likes someone more open.
Yes.
Which would be Emma.
Yes.
Then in chapter 25, Frank goes to get his hair cut. And Emma has this big blow to her approval of him, but then she tries to rationalise it afterwards.
And again, we've got behind all this, we've still got Emma having this argument with Mr. Knightley in her mind about Frank Churchill.
Yeah.
Actually, the bit I like there, I was just very taken with this sentence where she says, of pride indeed there was perhaps scarcely enough. His indifference to a confusion of rank bordered too much on inelegance of mind. She is noticing his confusion of rank, which isn't a confusion of rank. It's why he wants to hang around the Bateses and put up with what happens there.
Yeah. And then we get all this stuff about how Emma feels that the Coles are getting uppity.
Yeah.
And she thinks that the top families in the neighbourhood should hold aloof. And then she gets offended that she hasn't been invited to their dinner when everyone else has.
But on the other hand, again, it just shows her very, very isolated state.
Yeah.
That there she is, living in this town. She can't mix with the other county families, not in a sort of Mansfield Park way.
Yeah. It says that the idea of the party to be assembled there, consisting precisely of those whose society was dearest to her, occurred again and again. She did not know that she might not have been tempted to accept. And her being left in solitary grandeur, even supposing the omission to be intended as a compliment, was but poor comfort. It's a small society, and if people don't come to her, she doesn't have many opportunities to go out. Chapter 26, Dinner at the Coles, which is twice as long as any other chapter in the ones we've read today.
Yes. Oh, I know.
And so much happens in it.
But it's a fantastic chapter. The depth, almost every word tells you 3 different things about 3 different people. Yeah. A bit I love is the description of when Frank comes early into the drawing room and he wants to see Jane, and he pauses by her as he comes in and sort of greets her, then moves over to Emma, but watching Jane.
Yeah.
And then, after he's had the discussion about the Dixons with Emma, he says, I will go and tell her. And he walks across and he stands straight in front of her so that Emma can't see him.
Then Emma has her conversation with Mrs. Weston. And then after that, it's revealed that Frank has been with Jane this entire time.
Yes.
Which, again, probably seems like nothing the first time you read it, but leaps out.
And then he's continuing making occasions to be with her. He goes off and he sings with Emma. But since he's sung with Emma, obviously when Jane plays, he can sing with Jane.
Just jumping back to the conversation Emma has with Frank. This, I feel, really is... Frank is bringing out Emma's worst side, because they've known each other less than a week, and every step of the way he's encouraging her to say more.
Yes.
And she then reveals this really quite discreditable idea she has, and he just encourages it.
It's just outrageous.
Yes.
For her to have made up,
But see, she wouldn't have said it to Frank if Frank hadn't been encouraging her. She sort of, like Frank was in the previous chapter, taking things step by step, seeing how far it can go. She starts by suggesting Mrs. Dixon, but if Frank hadn't been receptive, and by receptive I mean if Frank hadn't been lying through his teeth, pretending that that sounds all very valid, she wouldn't have taken those extra steps.
Yes.
I think Frank is getting this horrible sort of fun out of seeing how far she has gone.
Well, he's just a terrible tease, but he's teasing about things that can really upset.
Yeah.
Well, the real sufferer is not Emma, but
it's
Jane.
Jane. Yeah.
Because no doubt he tells her all this.
Yeah. We know he's told her at some point because of the letters game when he spells out Dixon. She obviously knows then.
Yes.
So whether he told her tonight at the dinner party or at some later stage, he's definitely told her that's what Emma thinks.
Yes.
And the other big conversation that happens at the dinner is Emma and Mrs. Weston, where Mrs. Weston says that she thinks Mr. Knightley is in love with Jane.
Yes.
Which is, to be fair,
a perfectly legitimate thing to say. You know, well, there's Mr. Knightley, and suddenly here's coming back a girl who is sort of fit to be his wife.
Yeah.
By education and background, if not by money. And, well, you know, part of his constituency, really.
Yeah. And he's done the thing of taking his carriage so that the Bateses can come in a carriage. And Emma is the one who's right here. It's just because he is a nice person who cares about people.
Unfortunately, we don't see him doing these neighbourly things to anyone except the Bateses, though no doubt there are people scattered all over the area that he's doing benevolent things for.
Yeah, because otherwise Emma wouldn't be saying that's so typical of him.
Yes. You can look at it as a form of benevolence and him seeing this as his duty as a squire.
Yeah.
And as a magistrate, but particularly as a squire.
Oh, I did notice this time when I read it, the bit about he kept no carriage horses, having little spare money and a great deal of health activity and independence. I did wonder at that little spare money, but then the notes in my Cambridge edition said that's because he's not spending his money on things like horses and clothes. He's putting it back into...
He's reinvesting it in improvements of some sort. Farming improvements, not improvements in the Southerton sense.
Yeah. So it doesn't mean he's poor. It means he's...
Well, look, he's a man at the prime of life, and this is the time for him to build up his estate.
Yep. And the chapter finishes with another enormous great lie by Frank Churchill. Perhaps it is as well, said Frank Churchill as he attended Emma to her carriage. I must have asked Miss Fairfax, and her languid dancing would not have agreed with me after yours. He goes out of his way to criticise Jane to Emma.
Yes.
Unnecessarily so. He's enjoying the subterfuge.
He thinks he's justified, but in fact it's something he likes doing.
Yeah.
He's teasing Emma. He's showing off.
Yeah.
The rather sad thing, I suppose you can say with that, is that Frank's coming is such a big deal for Emma, and Emma hardly matters to Frank, except as... I mean, the big thing for Frank is really more Mrs. Weston.
Mm. So what was your favourite sentence?
This is my favourite sentence. In he walked, the first and handsomest, and after paying his compliments en passant to Miss Bates and her niece, made his way directly to the opposite side of the circle where sat Miss Woodhouse, until he could find a seat by her, would not sit at all. The reason I've chosen it is because it just shows Jane Austen getting so much into what looks like a simple narrative. At the beginning, we've got her slightly contemptuous attitude to Frank's self-importance or self-love. We've got all this detail, this little account of him speaking to the Bateses and Jane, which sounds like nothing, except, of course, it's telling us about how he's keeping things up, him coming over to sit with Emma, and Emma sort of being so pleased with herself and interpreting it as this is Frank coming to her. There's so much said, and just said a straight narrative. It's just, when you think about it, absolutely amazing how much she can say in what sounds like simple narrative.
And in this particular case, with Emma being, as sometimes people have said, the first detective story, just
Yeah.
dropping in that little clue that you completely miss at the time, but then on a reread jumps out at you.
That's why he paused and
Yeah.
said, yes.
Well, my favourite sentence is more straightforward. It's when Emma's about to ask Mrs. Weston about should she accept the Coles invitation.
Yes.
And it said, something occurred while they were at Hartfield to make Emma want their advice, and, which was still more lucky, she wanted exactly the advice they gave. That's just much more one of Jane Austen's less sophisticated, cleverly balanced sentences.
Yes.
This week, we're going to be talking about Mr. and Mrs. Weston.
We know so much about the backstory for Mr. Weston and nothing of the backstory of Mrs. Weston.
Yeah.
How did she come to be such a well-educated, genteel person and have no relations at all?
Presumably they died.
But on the other hand, we know probably more about the personality of Mrs. Weston than we do of Mr. Weston.
I think we get both of their personalities. In one of the Talking About Jane Austen books, they comment on Mr. Weston as being someone who likes any company better than no company.
Yes.
I think one of the best quotes that encapsulates that, John Knightley only was in mute astonishment that a man who could have spent his evening quietly at home after a day of business in London should set off again and walk half a mile to another man's house for the sake of being in mixed company till bedtime, of finishing his day in the efforts of civility and the noise of numbers, was a circumstance to strike him deeply. And there's another quote that I think really encapsulates that, and also how much it annoys Emma, in the Box Hill section of the book, where Emma had been envisaging this small select party of people going to Box Hill.
Yeah.
And then Mr. Weston, when he hears that the Sucklings can't come, Mr. Weston just invites the Eltons as well. And it says, every feeling was offended, and the forbearance of her outward submission left a heavy arrear due of secret severity in her reflections on the unmanageable goodwill of Mr. Weston's temper.
Yes.
What you get with Mr. Weston is he loves company. He's always so optimistic.
Yeah.
But I think his one real vulnerability is Frank. He so wants him to come, and then he gets briefly disappointed when he doesn't, and then
Yes.
works out how it'll be better if he comes later. He sort of talks and talks and talks and talks about him, and then gets worried that he's raised expectations. And
Yes.
then the day after Frank's come, the second day, when Frank comes with Mrs. Weston, Mr. Weston has come in earlier that day just to make sure they did really like Frank.
Yes.
They are two of the loveliest people in the book.
Yes.
Mrs. Weston is so practical and so nice, and yet she's got a sense of humour because Emma makes her laugh reluctantly when she does her imitation of Miss Bates. Maybe she does have some culpability for Emma's high opinion of herself, because there was that bit in the chapters we read where when she and Emma are talking about Mr. Knightley and Jane Fairfax, and Emma's opinion wins, as it usually did.
Well, I think that's one of the things that when Mr. Knightley, when he and Mrs. Weston are talking about Emma, she says, you must have thought I wasn't a very good governess. And he says, that's right, I don't. I think you're a much better wife.
Yeah.
Because you're good at giving in.
Yeah. I suppose it is true that if Emma had been a different sort of person, she could have been a complete spoiled brat. She developed some level of accomplishment, but not as much as Miss Taylor could have given her. She didn't read as much as she should have. She got her own way probably more than she should have.
That was Mr. Knightley's view.
Yeah. But I think it also speaks really well of Mrs. Weston that Emma still sees her every day.
Yes.
Yeah. She has built up a really strong relationship with Emma, and maybe there were flaws in how she educated Emma.
You know, my feeling is not so much that she could have done much about it, that Emma, because of her father, was in this difficult situation.
Yeah.
I suppose there's the other interesting thing of Jane Austen through the Westons moving on to look at the society of Highbury, which more and more I now think is one of her joys in Emma. Well, she's moved to Chawton. She's starting to see a little country town rather than a rural village.
Mm.
She's seeing a lot less of the company of people like the Bennets and so on with moderate-sized estates.
Mm.
And she's just looking at what's sort of a commercial society.
Mm.
And she's interested.
Mm. This book has so many socially mobile people in it.
Yes.
You've got the aspirational Martins, you've got the Westons who have moved up a step, you've got the Coles who are in the process of moving up a step and Emma's very sniffy about it, and then you've got the Bateses who are going in the other direction.
Yes.
Much more so than in any of the other books.
One of the things I thought worth talking about was a little bit about what Randall's is like. We don't really know, has Randall's got a home farm or not?
He goes to the Crown about hay. Doesn't say whether he goes to the Crown to sell his hay or whether he goes to the Crown to buy hay.
What month was this in? If it was about June, July, he's probably selling it. If it's not in the middle of summer, he's probably buying it.
Okay. My gut feeling is it's probably earlier, so he's probably buying it for his carriage horses.
Yes. But it's just hard to work out, was Randall's a little manor house or was it a farm on Mr. Knightley's property that has had the ground sold in the way Hartfield has the ground sold and been turned into a little manor house?
Mm. It's not a huge house because we know it's only got 2 spare bedrooms.
That's right, which makes it about the same size as the house that the Dashwoods had, the one they called a cottage.
Yeah. I think we probably still have to assume it's bigger than, because it's not referred to as a cottage, so maybe it's only got the same number of bedrooms, but it might have an extra parlour or a bigger dining room.
Yes.
It might have extras of some of the other rooms and a larger servants' quarters.
Yes.
But it's still not huge.
Yes.
So the last thing I wanted to talk about with the Westons is Mrs. Weston's pregnancy. Because the first time I read the book, it took me totally by surprise. Not the mystery revealed like with Jane and Frank. I just, suddenly Mrs. Weston has a baby and where did that come from? So I actually have gone through the book carefully. Well, when I say I've gone through the book, I've also looked on the internet for other people who've gone through the book carefully for hints of the pregnancy. Because there are some that in hindsight you can see are references. So what we do know with the timeline, she gets pregnant probably in early October. Frank arrives in March and the dinner at the Coles happens when she's 5 months pregnant.
Pretty certainly it wouldn't be showing particularly.
Then the dinner at Hartfield in April, she's 6 months pregnant. The Crown Inn ball, she's 7 months pregnant. So she probably would be showing by then.
Yes.
And then in July, the baby is born. So at the strawberry picking, she's 8.5 months pregnant. One person on the internet has commented that it's alluded to in chapter 38, which is the second week in May, and mentioned specifically in chapter 42 in June, and the birth of Anna Weston occurs in chapter 53, which is late July. The reference in chapter 38, it's when Miss Bates arrives at the Crown Inn for the ball. It says, "She was now met by Mrs. Weston. Very well, I thank you, ma'am. I hope you are quite well. Very happy to hear it. So afraid you might have a headache. Seeing you pass by so often and knowing how much trouble you must have, delighted to hear it indeed." Now, this is absolutely meaningless to us, the reader at the time, but in hindsight, that suggests that Mrs. Weston is visibly pregnant and Miss Bates is talking about it. And I was thinking about the only other on-screen, as it were, pregnancy we have is in Sense and Sensibility with Charlotte Palmer. And in that, we get told up front, practically as soon as she appears on the scene, Mrs. Jennings says she expects to be confined in February. She and Charlotte talk about it a bit, but then Lady Middleton is very uncomfortable and changes the subject because it's not a nice thing to be talking about. I think we do clearly get this picture that you're not overtly talking about it. It's not genteel to overtly talk about it. So Miss Bates is talking about it without talking about it.
Yes.
But that puts a whole different picture on at the ball where Mr. Elton asks Mrs. Weston to dance with him because she's very visibly pregnant. Miss Bates has commented on it. So this is another one of those things that looks different when you're rereading it and makes it even more rude to Harriet that he says to the very pregnant Mrs. Weston, "I'll dance with you," but that he doesn't want to dance with Harriet.
Yeah.
Then what we get is in chapter 41, which is in June, by which time she's 8 months pregnant, we see that she's walking for exercise. Emma and Harriet were going to walk. On returning, they fell in with a larger party who, like themselves, judged it wisest to take their exercise early, as the weather threatened rain. Mr. and Mrs. Weston and their son, Miss Bates and her niece. At this stage, we know she's walking for exercise. She's 8 months pregnant, but she's going out walking. And she's walking in the good part of the day.
Yes.
No specific reference to pregnancy. That's just me noting what she's doing during her pregnancy. But in chapter 42, again, June, 8 months pregnant, we finally have an explicit reference to the pregnancy. So it's just talking about Highbury gossip, and it says, and the situation of Mrs. Weston, whose happiness it was to be hoped might eventually be as much increased by the arrival of a child as that of all her neighbours was by the approach of it. I think I missed it the first time through because you have to be reading quite attentively to realise that it's not just some theoretical future child. She is actually pregnant at the moment.
And all the neighbours are thrilled to bits about it.
Yes. Then we get the strawberry picking scene. And it says that Mr. Woodhouse was placed in one of the most comfortable rooms in the Abbey. Mrs. Weston, who seemed to have walked there on purpose to be tired and to sit all the time with him, remained when everyone else goes out and picks strawberries.
Yes.
Which is interesting because it means she has walked to Donwell. And on a quick skim of the book, I couldn't work out exactly how far Donwell is, but the internet seems to think Donwell is half a mile from Randalls, which is about 800 metres, which is quite a walk for someone who is 8 months pregnant. But on the other hand, I think if we think about the kind of lifestyle they had, maybe it is considered not too long a walk. And I think we also have to assume that when they were leaving, she would have been put in a carriage with someone. On the other hand, the next day when they go to Box Hill, she doesn't go to that at all. She stays with Mr. Woodhouse. Maybe what we're seeing here is that she is very pregnant and she's doing some things, but she's not doing other things. But then 2 weeks later, more or less, when the news comes of Frank and Jane's engagement, Mr. Weston comes and asks Emma to come and see Mrs. Weston. And Emma says, is she unwell? Which is, she's probably thinking, I hope everything's okay.
Yes.
But then Mr. Weston says, no, not at all, only a little agitated. She would have ordered the carriage and come to you, but she must see you alone. Now, this is the first time we hear of her using the carriage to come to Hartfield.
Yes.
Every other time she has walked to Hartfield. So 2 weeks after walking to Donwell, she is now presumably too far advanced. She doesn't want to walk another half mile. So that, I think, is the progression of her pregnancy. And then, of course, in chapter 48, there's an explicit reference that the child to be born at Randalls must be a tie there even dearer than herself. And I think the first time I read it, that for me was the first time I actually saw, oh, Mrs. Weston is pregnant.
Yes.
Because I missed that earlier one, whereas this is very explicit. And then, of course, the baby is born in chapter 53.
Yes.
There are very few hints the first time through, but on this second reading, they're not hints, but I think you just are getting, in those last couple of months, a little picture of how it's impacting her life.
Yes. Yeah.
And how she's not letting it impact her life, where she is still walking to Donwell.
Yes. Usually in these historical background pieces, I try to give an account based on information from reading I've done that explains aspects of Regency life that would have been known to Jane Austen's first readers, but are mysterious to readers encountering them in the 21st century. In this session, however, I'll be doing this almost the other way round, looking for evidence in Emma of social customs that I don't know much about. I'm looking for scraps of evidence that tell about the sort of customs I'd probably know lots about if I'd ever come across Regency etiquette manuals, which has never actually happened. The first custom I want to talk about is women calling on other women. Jane Austen's novels seem to suggest that this was a coded way of negotiating a social relationship. To call on someone indicated that the caller wanted to establish or continue a social relationship. The speed with which the call was returned and the length of time the caller remained in the house indicated what level of intimacy the caller considered appropriate. We get an example here when Robert Martin's sister called on Harriet at Mrs. Goddard's. This, I think, can be taken as a message from Miss Martin that although Harriet has refused her brother's offer of marriage, she hopes their friendship will continue. Emma, however, is determined to put an end to the friendship, but does not want to absolutely violate the calling conventions to do it. So Emma therefore makes sure the call lasts only a quarter of an hour. She has no doubt what message this will give.
The notes in my Cambridge edition to that bit say a quarter of an hour. This is a time that might properly be occupied by an entirely formal visit, but certainly not by a visit to a family with whom one has been on intimate terms. John Trussler, in A System of Etiquette, gives the following advice. On paying visits of ceremony, care should be taken not to make them too long nor too frequent. A quarter of an hour or 20 minutes is sufficient time to exchange compliments or run over the topics of the day.
And that, of course, we get the point you made earlier of how the conversation is formal and they're just getting into the more personal when Emma breezes in and sweeps Harriet away. Jane Austen had already given it a sample of how a message like this was received in Pride and Prejudice. In the latter part of the book, Jane goes to London in the hope of meeting Bingley again and calls on his sister. Jane writes, "My visit was not long, as Caroline and Mrs. Hurst were going out." Reading this, Elizabeth is convinced that Miss Bingley is attempting to discourage further contact. She is proved right by Jane's next letter. After waiting at home every morning for a fortnight and inventing every evening a fresh excuse for her, the visitor did at last appear, but the shortness of her stay, and yet more, the alteration of her manner, would allow Jane to deceive herself no longer. We do, of course, today still have various wordless ways of giving these messages, but Jane Austen's novels show how in her time the formal etiquette of paying calls was used for this purpose.
And the reverse situation later in Pride and Prejudice, where Darcy, at Pemberley, Darcy asks Elizabeth if he might introduce his sister. And Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner believe that he will be very prompt and it will be the day after Georgiana arrived. So they plan to stay in that day. But in fact, it's the very day of her arrival. You kind of picture Georgiana getting out of the carriage and Darcy grabbing her and dragging her straight off to the inn to meet them. But again, it gives this clear picture of what you expect in terms of timing of how soon this call will be made.
This whole coded way of telling one another what you expect.
Is the business of leaving cards something that's codified in Jane Austen's day, or does that come up a bit later?
Well, I know it was very codified later, having read about it in Victorian etiquette books. It's definitely there, turning down corners and leaving husbands' cards and that sort of thing. It's all spelled out, but we don't get any of that really in Jane Austen. The next aspect of social life that I want to talk about is the formal dinner party. The formal dinner party at the Coles in Emma gives us details of another set of customs that my half-knowledge makes it difficult for me to decode. The general impression I've gained is that a whole range of food, soup, vegetables, meat and poultry roasts, made dishes like the fricassee of asparagus and sweetbreads that Mr. Woodhouse denies to his guests were placed on the table all at the same time. And this is confirmed from a little piece I found on the internet coming from, I think, the Jane Austen gift shop. What they say is guests who sat down to eat were faced with soup, meat, game, pickles, jellies, vegetables, custards, puddings, anywhere from 5 to 25 dishes. And that's the picture I've got. But what I never get clear is how, if all this food was in serving dishes on the table, how did it get transferred to the diners' plates? And we also read of hosts and even guests carving the roasts. So how did this food get onto the plates? I tend to assume at the moment that at small parties the guests would have served one another, while at grand dinner parties like the Coles one, there would have been footmen to help. But how was it done? Were the guests' plates passed down to the serving dishes, or were the serving dishes passed up to the guests? And again, this passage from the Jane Austen gift shop is some help, but not complete. The first course would have been soup, which the host would supervise the serving of. When that was finished and cleared away, he would carve the larger joints of meat, mutton, beef, etc. The gentlemen of the party would serve themselves from the dishes in front of them and offer them to their neighbours. If a dish was required from another part of the table, a manservant would be sent to fetch it. Fortunately, guests were not expected to try every dish on the table. But one thing, anyway, that the Coles dinner makes clear is the different meaning that course had in Jane Austen's time. It seems that all the table was cleared of the first set of dishes, and a new set, similar in style, was put on the table in its place, and we've got this real little description of how it's happening. The conversation, that is Emma's with Frank Churchill, was here interrupted. They were called on to share in the awkwardness of a rather long interval between the courses, and obliged to be as formal and as orderly as the others. But when the table was again safely covered, when every corner dish was placed exactly right, occupation and ease were generally restored. And what I can't help wondering, what happened to what was taken back to the kitchen? No doubt the servants had some fine feasting, but did any of it reach the labourers, whose most important meal was usually bacon with their bread? Or did it all go to the Coles or some farmers' hens and pigs? It's one of these thoughts that suddenly pops up to you when you're thinking about Jane Austen's world.
Yeah.
The terrible, terrible, unfair distribution of good things. But this second course, we gather from Emma, was not the end of the meal. This internet source says, the second course was cleared, the cloth taken away, and dessert was served, usually nuts, fruits, sweetmeats, and perhaps ice cream. So you've got a bare table now, and you've just got little piggy things that you can eat.
So nibblies, basically, finger food.
Chatting food, yes. We get another interesting thing, turns up a lot in Victorian novels here, that Emma tells us, and that is, I'll read the piece. The rest of the dinner passed away. The dessert succeeded. The children came in and were talked to and admired amid the usual rate of conversation. I really liked the picture of the little Cole girls dressed in fresh white muslin, the ones who were just beginning to learn the piano, being brought in. And also, what it makes me think of is the kind of context in which Sir Thomas developed his picture of his daughters, having them paraded before him by Mrs. Norris, and a frightened Fanny having to answer his questions without any help. What we've got is this picture of the children being brought in at the dessert, which obviously means they can they can look forward to it because they'll have a chance to get these sweet things. This having the children in for dessert is a custom that turns up in novels and children's books right through the Victorian period. I think we're all familiar with what happened next. The hostess rose to her feet and led the ladies out of the room and up to the drawing room, while the men began passing round the port and joining the ladies when they got tired of listening to the other men talking shop, as Frank Churchill does here, and, if you remember, as Henry Crawford did in Mansfield Park when Edmund and Dr. Grant were talking about clergymen and money.
Is the etymology of the drawing room the fact that it was a room into which the ladies withdrew?
Yes, that's why it was called the drawing room.
Uh-huh.
Particularly in townhouses, it was usually on the floor above.
Uh-huh.
Now, the dining room on the ground floor, nearer to the kitchens. But when they went upstairs, of course, what they had was tea. At some point, they start offering anyone who comes up tea or coffee, and that turns up in all the Jane Austen books.
Of course, that's in Pride and Prejudice, towards the end where they have the dinner party and Elizabeth is serving tea or coffee, I can't remember, and she's hoping to have a chance to talk to Mr. Darcy, but then the young girl next to her says, "I won't let the men separate us."
Yes. Then I think the next one we want to note about the Coles dinner party is this business of asking other people to come and join them for tea when they've had a big dinner party. Jane Fairfax and Harriet and so on having been asked. And it sounds sort of rude. This is one of these things that Emma raises, and we don't have an answer to it. But I have been trying to think of something equivalent today of asking people after dinner. And it could be a bit the same as if you've got somebody staying with you and you say to somebody, "Oh, well, they'll be with us in the evening, why don't you drop in and see us?" It could fit into some pattern like that. Anyway, it's obviously something done that you ask other people.
For today's pop culture section, I'm talking about the most recent film adaptation of Emma, the 2020 cinema release by Working Title Films, starring Anya Taylor-Joy as Emma and Johnny Flynn as Mr. Knightley. In this one, just in terms of ages, Anya Taylor-Joy was 24 and Johnny Flynn was 37.
Oh, that sounds reasonable.
Yeah. However, in contrast to Emma being 24, Mia Goth, who plays Harriet, was 27. She did look younger and she was actually really quite nice.
Yes.
The main thing about this one, and I think what makes it stand or fall for the viewer, is it's very stylish and stylized. And so I think your reaction to the film is going to be driven largely by whether or not that works for you. It's very, very focused on the look, and I think this is done sometimes to the detriment of the characterization.
What do you mean by the look?
Okay, well, when the servants are moving around, there are times when it's almost like a choreographed dance.
Oh, right.
And I listened to the commentary and they said what they were trying to do with that was how life was operating like clockwork. The background music choices were unexpected, not period pieces. And again, sometimes that actually worked quite well for me. At other times, I found it very jarring.
By jarring, what you mean is when it was working, you were engaging with the film. When the music came and you suddenly started listening to the music, you felt that was distracting.
At one point, the background music was a sea shanty. I think it was either going to work for you or it wasn't. And if it didn't, it really didn't. Mrs. Goddard's students, and she only had 6 couple of students, by the way, they were all wearing red cloaks. And
that's a dreadful thing to do. Girls wearing matching cloaks came from charity schools. That was what it was telling you. That is absolutely out of character.
But again, it was done for the look of it.
No, you don't only have to read the basic books about the history of girls' boarding schools to know that if they went to a charity school, they didn't pay fees. Mrs. Goddard could only have been a girls' boarding school.
Well, that actually does feed into my next point. The costumes were exquisite. Every historical costume person who has a YouTube channel has raved over the costumes in Emma. Now, apparently many of them are based on extant garments, and they can identify the garments that they were based on. And one YouTube video I watched, and I'll put links to some of these videos in the show notes, one of them was thrilled to see that some of it was clearly hand-stitched. But the problem is, while the costumes are beautifully made and they look lovely, the colour palettes are gorgeous, but I felt they didn't always fit the character that well. In particular, Mr. Knightley was very fashionably dressed with very high collars and what I think was meant to be that windswept hairstyle you read about so often in Georgette Heyer, which I have no doubt was absolutely historically accurate.
Yeah.
But I don't feel that Mr. Knightley would have been dressed to that extent. I feel Mr. Knightley was the sort of person who would have worn the high collar when he was going to dinner at the Coles,
Yeah.
but he wouldn't have worn it when he was dropping in on Hartfield in the evening.
But when you think of the distance he walked.
Yeah. And his windswept hairstyle, I kind of felt he looks like he's the one that needs to go to London to get a haircut.
Yes.
And like I said, it was probably a historically accurate hairstyle. It just didn't feel to me to be the right hairstyle for Mr. Knightley. So I'm slightly at odds with the costume experts here, but I will say it looked beautiful. It really looked absolutely gorgeous. Now, the other thing, and this kind of fits in with the costumes as well, it's all lifted up the social scale. And this is most evident, I think, through the sets. In particular, Hartfield was filmed at Firle Place in East Sussex. Now, I looked this up on Wikipedia. Firle Place was a manor house, and it dates from the time of Henry VIII, but it was remodeled extensively during the Georgian period. So they obviously chose it because it had a beautiful Georgian interior. But the thing with Firle Place, again, as I said, I got this from Wikipedia. It was owned by the Gage family by then. They were baronets who became viscounts in the 18th century. And the person who was responsible for this remodelling, I believe, was Henry III Viscount, who married his cousin, who was also wealthy.
Yes.
So between their inheritances, he was considered one of the wealthiest peers in England. The house itself is big, and I just felt this is too big for the Hartfield that is just a house on the edge of town that has a nice garden but doesn't have extensive estates.
Yes.
And then there's Donwell Abbey. Donwell was filmed at Wilton House in Wiltshire. But the thing is, Wilton House for 400 years has been the country seat of the Earls of Pembroke.
Yes.
So again, it's just bigger and grander and more extensive. And I'm not saying it didn't look beautiful. It looked absolutely gorgeous. They both looked gorgeous, but it felt too grand for Emma to me. So I guess just this focus on the look, you could say, and I'm parts of the film I certainly do feel, there was more style than substance, and I felt that this focus on the look did detract from the characters. Now, I will give it credit and say it had a lot of lines from the book in it, unlike some of the earlier versions.
Yes.
Sometimes it was authorial comment given to a character, which often annoys me. Sometimes the lines were to the wrong person, but it did have a lot of dialogue from the book, so I'll pay it for that. But one thing that really did strike me, particularly with Emma and Mr. Knightley, is up until the Box Hill scene, I really didn't get a sense of them as realistic, believable people. Emma, watching it, I just kept writing down these words, trying to work out how I saw her. I wrote down annoyed, disdainful, exasperated, bored, irritated. And the word I've ended up settling on to describe her for everything up to Box Hill is supercilious. Everything is just perfect. Her clothing, her expression, but there's no emotion behind it. She doesn't seem to be getting joy out of anything. Now, Mr. Knightley, I felt he was very histrionic.
Yes, that is not an adjective you'd normally use about Mr. Knight.
No, particularly after the ball, he must have had this revelation of how he feels about Emma. And you have this scene of him running to Hartfield and Emma seeing him out the window. And then I think Frank Churchill arrived, so he went back to Donwell and he was lying face down on the floor and a servant came in and then went away. It was all so external and I just didn't believe it. It didn't give me any sympathy with him as a character. However, one thing I really, really, really liked and thought this film actually did better than any of the others, and it was something that hadn't even struck me, is the Box Hill scene. When Mr. Knightley comes and he's telling off Emma, and he starts by saying, "How could you be so unfeeling?" Some of the other Mr. Knightley started out angry at that point. He's not angry at this point. He's disappointed and he's baffled. It's like he just cannot believe Emma has done this.
Oh.
And then he becomes angry and it leads up into, badly done Emma. But I really liked that. I thought it worked so well, and it was the first moment in the entire film I believed in his emotional life.
Yes.
And then it's after that point that we do get much more genuine emotion from Emma. It kind of makes you see, okay, all that earlier stuff was intentionally done so you could see this great change in her. But there'd been a lot of movie where she was just so distant and so supercilious that it was hard to connect. Harriet was very naturalistic, and at times it was almost like she was from a different film. Many details of the Harriet Mr. Elton plot were dropped. There was no precious treasures. I don't think there was the riddle book or the charade. But what you do get is this change in personality of Harriet becoming more confident as the film progresses.
Yeah.
Something I didn't pick up on, but the commentary pointed out, is that over the film, Harriet becomes more and more able to ignore the servants. But what I did really like, and this was both Harriet and Emma's performance in this scene, and I thought it was perhaps Emma's most beautiful moment, is Harriet comes to Emma and she says, Mrs. Goddard has told me who my father is. He is a tradesman in Bristol. And she's sort of basically standing there and saying, you can sort of see it in her face, I'm not going to apologise for this. You're not going to like this, but this is what it is. And Emma says she hopes Harriet brings him to visit at Hartfield. That's where sort of you see the journey Emma has come on, that she values Harriet's friendship and she's asking her to bring her father. And I just thought that was a lovely scene, played out so well by both of them, and they both came across as very naturalistic in that.
Yes.
I really enjoyed that scene. Bill Nighy as Mr. Woodhouse was really funny, but he was absolutely not the Mr. Woodhouse from the book.
All right.
He was much more played as eccentric and over the top. He ran into a room at one point. He was so alert about drafts and things. There's a scene where he's sitting absolutely surrounded by fire screens. I enjoyed every moment he was on screen, and I felt he had very little to do with the Mr. Woodhouse of the book. I've talked in the previous adaptations that some of them sacrifice the Harriet and Mr. Elton plot, but more often they sacrifice the Jane and Frank plot to fit the length of time they have available.
Yes.
This one sacrificed plot points from both, but the Jane and Frank plot was probably sacrificed more. At least this time we do learn that it was Frank who sent the piano. Emma works it out, whereas in some of the others it wasn't ever even explained.
Is it in any way turned into a slight mystery plot?
It is. You don't know until it happens.
And do you wonder?
I'm not sure. Possibly.
Yes. Either you see it as a mystery plot or you suddenly get a terrible surprise.
Yeah. In most of the others, I've talked about some what on earth were they thinking moments, and this one has one of the most extreme of those. The first one I want to mention, though, is that for reasons best known for themselves, John and Isabella do not have a happy marriage, which I think is really sad, because it is a happy marriage in the book in spite of their differences, and they do love their kids and they do love each other, and here they're just sniping at each other. It's not...
Oh, right.
I just didn't like it. Another one I've already mentioned, the scene of Mr. Knightley running to Hartfield after the ball and then going home and lying face down on the floor. I just thought...
Yes.
They said in the commentary he was having a panic attack. I didn't really get that. It just seemed unnecessary, and histrionic was the word I used before.
Yes.
But the most extreme what on earth were they thinking moment is in the proposal scene with Mr. Knightley proposing to Emma. Emma is so... Well, I don't know what the rationale behind it was, but Emma gets a nosebleed in that scene. Apparently, the director wanted to include a nosebleed because she gets them herself, and it's a way of bodily function reflecting emotion, but it was just weird. I didn't feel it reflected emotion or stress or reaction. I just felt it took you right out of the scene, and maybe that was the idea. So like I said, this was a very stylized production. It was very beautiful. It was nice to look at. The costumes were accurate. The landscape was lovely. I won't say I didn't enjoy watching the film, but I didn't really feel it captured the spirit of Emma, at least as I read it. So that was the last of the direct adaptations of Emma. For our next episode in the pop culture section, I'm going to be looking at the 90s classic film Clueless. You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
And me, Ellen. In our next episode, we'll be looking at chapters 27 to 31 of Emma.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and our website, readingjaneausten.com.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.